Welcome to another episode of Stewart Squared. Last week we talked about space. We talked about AI and why AI isn't here yet. And today we have no idea what we're going to talk about. We're going to find something. Actually, we talked about the Gen Z and the Gen X and the Gen and the millennial and the boomer differentiation and how the Gen Z is going to be very interesting, a very interesting generation because they don't know what is true and they don't know what is false anymore. But let's go back into history because actually we were talking about the laser printer and how the laser printer came around and basically revolutionized desktop publishing. But for me, I've just been thinking about it all week, how it's just another object in the room. And what when we could even go back before the personal computer, what was the first object in the room that really got you interested? Maybe when you were like, it was probably the TV. Can you talk more about how the TV came into your life?
Wow, I guess. So, as you know, I was born in 1952 and we did not have a television at that time. Uh, and the first television we had was black and white. There were no color. Uh, and my father insisted on getting the television so he could watch the news because that was his business. And I don't remember exactly when we got a television, but the big event at the time was that the first TV presidency was JFK,
Versus Nixon, right?
yeah, versus Nixon, and uh, Nixon had a habit of like sweating, and he didn't come off well on television, whereas JFK was like had the hair and um, spoke really well on Camelot and that whole thing. Um, so he was elected in 1960, and uh, and then was assassinated in 1963. And then LBJ became president and did one more term uh, to 68 when he stood down. Everybody thinks Biden was the first one to step down, but actually, LBJ could have run again, but he decided not to. Um, and so television was present for all of that. Eisenhower was elected in 52, year I was born, and there was no television. So, and he had two terms, so he went until 1960. So sometime while Eisenhower was president, that televisions became a thing. And there were televisions before, but this is it's a little bit like autonomous cars.
Mm,
Um, it doesn't really matter until it's everywhere.
yeah. Yeah.
And the original problem with television wasn't the television set, but the broadcast. The first broadcasts were only like a couple hours a day, not worth
Wait,
buying
wait,
a
wait. Can you go into that? This is something that you remember too. Like, there's a couple
No,
hours.
I don't remember it because this is kind of when I was born and, till the age of 4, 6, somewhere in there. I remember growing up with the television, right? Part of it I remember. But we didn't have a television when I was born.
Yeah.
And we
Okay.
moved into the hut. Do you remember the Springland
Yep.
house?
Yep.
We moved into that 6 months after I was born. So later in 1952. So, I don't, do you remember your first 4 or 5 years?
No, I
Uh,
remember that. I remember the 1989 earthquake. That I believe is my first memory at 4 years old. Um,
yeah.
but yeah.
Yeah,
So
you,
so
you were surfing the earthquake.
yeah. And so there were these broadcasts that would happen at various times of the day, but this is something you read. What like so would they all be at the same time? How do you know how that evolution went from like we've got this new thing, some people own it, some people don't.
Yeah, and there weren't very many people with televisions, which made it hard to justify the cost of doing a broadcast. Um, but it happened. I was not sentient at the time, so I don't remember exactly how it happened. I've read about it, right? But
But by the time you were in your teens or your tens or something like that, that was when you could go to the television at a certain time every day and it would be the same three or four networks.
there were only three originally: CBS, ABC, and NBC. Um, it, let's see, CBS. What was CBS?
Central
ABC was
Broadcasting
American
System.
Broadcasting Company, NBC was National Broadcasting Company, and ABC, I guess, no, CBS was,
CBS, yeah.
can't remember what the C stood for. Um, the and you know there's a lot written about it, the beginning of television. So but it's not part of my
Repertoire.
first race.
Yeah.
Right then, we got a television, and we got a color television, which was in the late 50s, in time for that 1960 presidential election.
So it wasn't
And
color. I thought it was black and white. So it was in color that JFK was versus Nixon.
I believe so,
Yeah. Yeah.
because they had debates, right?
And I remember that Nixon outperformed in the radio, people reviewing the radio, but he was outperformed by JFK in the TV because JFK looked so slick.
Yeah, and spoke well. Uh, color TV. I'm using Google. I probably should be using Perplexity, but I just read an email that Perplexity is giving its way to all the UC Berkeley students, and so
Oh,
there's thousands of students using Perplexity.
so the
Nope,
growth
that
channel.
was the first 1960 presidential debate was in black and white.
Yeah, okay. Um, okay, and then so the TV comes on the scene and it like there was probably no fundamental change between that black and white to color except to color, and then from color to cable news. Cable news came out in the 90s, but from basically
Later,
19
yeah, much
yeah,
later.
1960 to 1990 the TV was the same thing.
So there were also rules about television,
Uh,
and which were developed in the 60s, probably the 70s. One was that the same local television couldn't, the local television station couldn't be owned by the newspaper. They had to be separate
oh,
ownership,
interesting.
which was changed about 10, 15 years ago. Um, the But that was kind of a smart thing because you
Yeah.
didn't want to have a single company owning all of the local, and TV was local, right? There was shows and they were distributed through the local TV stations. So the TV stations were powerful. Cable is what started to break that down, but and there were usually three, so they were affiliated with a particular broadcast network. So there would be an ABC affiliate, a CBS affiliate, and an NBC affiliate. And then there were set, we did get more channels, and I'm trying to remember. Oh, so TNT
Mm,
um, was started by uh,
I'm getting it.
yeah,
So TNT American TV Network, Turner Network Television, Ted Turner.
Ted Turner. Yeah, thank you.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then did he also start CNN?
Oh, interesting. Did Ted Turner start CNN? Yep, yep. In 1980, creating the first world's first 24-hour news channel.
Yeah. Now that was done on broadcast, not on cable. So when
Oh.
cable started up, it gave CNN. Well, actually, it's what made CNN so global.
They were the first ones to so they could because they had started in 1980 with just broadcast and then cable news. What do you know the technology behind cable news? I've heard the word cable news. I treat it with such disdain for what I think it did to the to everybody. Um,
Not necessarily cable. Cable was cable, and then there was news on cable. Um, the thing about cable was that it was ever present, right? You didn't have to have a broadcast signal to
yeah.
turn the TV on. It was always on. And so CNN was the first 24-hour news station. Um, that was the thing about CNN, and then they did a deal distributing it in other countries. So if you traveled like I did, you could get CNN in China or anywhere, and you would be broadcast in English, so you could get your news anywhere in the world, presuming you were in a hotel with a cable news with CNN on it. So I can't remember exactly how cable happened. It was, and I was sentient when that happened,
Yeah.
but paying attention. Um, but John Malone was one of the very first entrepreneurs who started stitching together cable stations because cable was done locally, like broadcast had been done. But then John Malone went around buying up local stations, and there were two of them. Can't remember who the other one was. Maybe Barry Diller. Um, so there ended up being consolidation in the cable business, and it didn't make much of a difference at the first because the cable uh, technologies have been different in different places. So they started integrating from the back end.
Yeah, I found it here. So the fundamental breakthrough was the development of cable television infrastructure, which enabled 24-hour news broadcasting, starting with CNN's launch in 1980.
Yeah,
Um, and the first Gulf War was the first moment where it turned it into something real. And that so the cable news networks operate on hybrid fixed fiber coax networks, HFC networks. These networks combine fiber optic and coaxial cable technology to deliver
they're really
content.
much more coax than fiber.
Much more coax than fiber. Then were they part of the reason why internet started to go on fiber?
No,
Oh, it's totally separate.
yeah, totally separate because original internet was dial-up
Yeah.
modems. Um, so if you imagine any neighborhood,
Yeah.
um, it might be that they used fiber optics to bring cable to a neighborhood,
Mm.
but then they had to dig up the streets and put coax in the streets and then run them each individually to every house. So that was very expensive, a lot of money, and very well relatively slow to get serious penetration. Um, but if CNN was the first 24-hour news on cable, was, I don't know. You'd probably have to go. I'll be making it up, but probably penetrated like 60% of the households by 1990.
Mm. Cable news. There's something that's brewing in the background that I've actually wanted to ask you as I've been reading the biography on my grandfather and my great uncle about how, because you had mentioned that the broadcast was also syndicated. So it was a local TV show, but then they would have syndicated, I'm assuming national TV shows
Or
like I Love Lucy or
confusing.
whatever. And,
The
but that,
confusing column was syndicated in newspapers.
oh, but you had said there in terms of the three TV stations, the broadcast networks, they were owned locally, and then they would have a TV show like I Love
They'd be
Lucy
affiliated with
affiliated. Got it. Okay.
yeah.
And then but
There's
the
always like a 3 or 4 letter K thing. I think it's maybe W, and there'd be some letter designation for the local station. And so the broadcasters would broadcast to receivers at the local um, TV station.
mm,
It did go over a wire.
uh, wait, how would they get the actual TV to those local? They would so a show like I Love Lucy. How did that get into the home of every
So,
American?
so they were broadcast by it through satellites in geosynchronous orbit.
Oh,
Um, and geosynchronous means it stays in one place, right? It's geographically synchronous. So they're way out there, right? There are only a few of them, and they're horribly expensive, but it was worth it for the broadcasters to put up satellites, and and then they could broadcast to every station in America.
so I did fact check the cable television, how many households it got, and you were exactly right. About 60% of American homes had cable subscriptions by 1990.
Wow,
Yeah.
I know more than I think I do.
uh, so there were satellites that there were geostationary satellites. That's how both local TV, no, because like what are the on the boxes of the television, we used to have to go and manipulate the top of the thing to get the signal.
Rabbit ears.
The rabbit ears, yeah. Yeah.
Uh, so it'd be broadcast to the local station, and the station would rebroadcast it to
Ah,
home,
got it.
and you
So
had
so it
the
was a local
antennas,
station was getting the satellite
satellite
broadcast.
feed,
Yeah.
and then would rebroadcast it to homes based on uh, so if there are three stations in every municipality, they each had to have a receiver and then a sender. Don't know what the technical term is. And in theory, that would get to through the building and into your TV through the rabbit ears, the antenna. It was pretty
Mhm.
crappy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, no
Well,
remote, right?
yeah.
Didn't have a remote yet. To change the channel, you have to get out of your chair and go to the TV and
Yeah. Well,
change the channel.
and this is the funny thing. This gets in us into history, but where both of us were alive was that I remember you talking about a lot about TiVo. I also remember you talking a lot about the remote control, and you could never find a remote control that actually did what it was supposed to do. And I remember this was because manufacturers would basically have no incentive, and they didn't know technology. They didn't know what they were doing, so they would just design this giant remote that would have like three buttons on it that were important, but the rest of the buttons didn't really do anything.
Not totally accurate. Let's see if I can sort that out. So when it was cable television, the cable was attached to a set-top box. So instead
Mm.
of an antenna, it was actually physically attached to the coax cable, which went out through your walls and into the street. Um, uh, Before that, all they had were three um, broadcast channels. And initially, the broadcasters didn't want to put them on cable. Um, but then you started to see the cable channels develop. Um, TNT was one of the first, and then CNN for news. TNT was really old movies. Turner had bought a lot of old movies, and so you could watch TNT and watch movies that you probably hadn't seen before because, it's the first time they had that kind of reach. And but then the big deal, probably in the 90s, was new cable channels. So there was sports channels and, like tennis. They had a tennis channel. That happened a little later. But originally they were the national leagues signed up to broadcast their sports through cable because it was much easier to get. Um,
There's a dog there.
Hi, Dallas. Yeah. Hi,
You can keep
Dallas.
on going.
Yeah, I know. This is entertaining for our viewers. Uh,
Go
the
for it.
so I mean, there's a transition. It had many steps along the way, right? So it's really, and that's our dog. Um, so hey, Teach, stop. The So it's very hard for me to sort out the steps because it was happening in real time, basically. Like I wasn't necessarily paying attention to each step, but I can kind of get the general transitions from one to another. So I guess the 90s were the decade of cable and the internet started to become available commercially in 95, 96, and that's the year I became a VC. And at first, though, you had to do dial-up modems. Actually, the first internet was AOL. You
Uh-huh.
dial into AOL through a proprietary protocol, and then you had AOL. But it was like 96 baud modems, 9600 baud modems. It's like, we didn't know better. But if you tried to use a 9600 baud modem right now, you'd just be like frustrated out of your mind.
Well, let's go into that. How much information could you get off a modem? What is that compared to the type of things that are going through the Wi-Fi? Like, what types of things could you done with that?
Very little. Could do AOL.
Text.
Could do CompuServe. But you'd be dialing through the modem into a service. AOL and CompuServe had to deploy their own receiving modems, right? The modems would talk to each other.
Mm.
And so they had to build like these offices with a lot of modems in it so people could dial in locally,
Oh, they needed a modem for each single one, each
pretty
single
much
connection. Wow.
in the beginning. Yeah. And that's why it was a proprietary protocol. And people started mistaking AOL for the internet. until, we got farther down the road. Because so when I got on the internet when I was at InfoWorld in 94. And I think InfoWorld had a T1, I can't try to remember what it was called, which was considered high speed. It was a persistent connection, right? It's like having a network out to the rest of the world. So that wasn't that bad, but most people had to use a modem to dial in. And Bob Metcalf, who was publisher of InfoWorld at the time, he was my boss. He was widely known as the inventor of Ethernet, which
Uh,
was local area networking inside
yeah,
a building.
so this is funny because it's just the whole show is me basically finding a term that I've heard many times and then being like, wait, what is that? So what is the Ethernet? What is a local area network? What does that allow us to do?
Yeah, I think I told you about collision avoidance.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So in a network, an internal network inside a building, the IT people or whoever would actually embed wires in the wall. And Ethernet was the standard for that wire.
Mm.
And so they would open up the walls. Not always, sometimes they just have them hanging in the middle of coming from a drop down ceiling.
Yeah.
But you had to have a wire between any two computers. Um, and then that would be persistent, right? It would be plugged into, in the early PCs, would be plugged into a card that was stuck on the PC. um, and in theory, you'd have hundreds of computers attached to Ethernet. The value of it was a little mysterious because, now we know that we get access to all the information worldwide. We can get
Yeah.
anywhere,
Yeah, yeah.
so China. And the Great Firewall. Um, the So basically, originally when you had a PC, you had your information on a hard disk,
Yeah.
and a guy named Bill Gross invented the fastest search on a PC, but you were
Mm.
only searching what you had, right? Wasn't that big a deal because, oh yeah, you could find a file on your hard drive, your hard disk, which probably was only 5 MB at the time, and you kind of know where your stuff was on a PC,
Mm.
just
So
because you put.
it wasn't a big thing.
No, it wasn't a big thing, but it was really fast. So people noticed Bill Gross's search. I can't remember what it was called. And so then when you were networked inside a building, and InfoWorld was networked inside a building, um, you could you have to use commands in DOS to go look at a different hard drive. It wasn't integrated. So you had to know where the
Uh,
computer was that had the hard drive that you wanted to search. There was no search across the computers, but you might be looking at 10 or 20 or 100 computers. So that was like a big step forward. But even today, even with browsers, most corporate information is hidden
no, yep. Yep.
because they don't want anybody looking at
Yep.
it. That's the last frontier. Um, So this is the stepwise thing, Oh, wow, you could connect the computers together inside a building and you could go look at someone else's computer. Um, Apple actually did a different protocol that allowed you to treat other people's hard disks as drives on your own computer.
Uh,
So you could mount someone else's hard disk on your uh, desktop. The
Brilliant.
So I mean, there are all these increments, and every time an increment happened, it's like everybody would get like all excited. And even when the internet came out, um, in 95 as a commercial thing, um, that it was still dial up. You have to dial into a service that would connect you to the internet, um, and which was mostly AOL at the time. So it kept talking about broadband. Nobody really knew what broadband was, but the idea of broadband was that you would have your your computer connected to the internet persistently, so you could sit down at your computer and browse the internet or search it. And Google search, of course, there was another one before Google, but Google search, which was like introduced in, look it up, 99,
Yeah,
something.
yeah.
Google search, uh, the Sergey and
Larry.
Larry.
1996, the project began as Backrub. 1997, the domain was registered. 1998, Google was officially founded, and yeah, so it looks like 1998.
So it was originally uh, the Stanford University Network is what stands for Sun Microsystems, a workstation company like 15 years earlier. Um, but these guys were at Stanford. Stanford had a high-speed broadband network inside the campus. And so they developed this ability to search based on a proxy, which are the number of references to a particular document,
Hmm.
which was a citations. And I'm completely blanking on what they called that, but
It's
but
not PageRank though. PageRank was the
PageRank,
Google.
yes, it
Yeah.
was PageRank.
Hmm.
So they could tell how relevant a search was based on the number of citations towards a document. And that was PageRank. And it was like amazingly fast.
So
And in dial-up days, um, before broadband happened. So you could find anything on the internet. Um, Previously, you had to well, Yahoo was the original thing, which had uh, an ontology where they organized the information in a logical way, and you'd have to go like try to figure out what the logic was.
so I've
Google
I've,
just
I've
obviated that.
So, and you've been talking about these things like the fact that somebody came in and made the on the hard drive search possible, but then the Ethernet was really difficult. And it sounds like somebody in academia, usually in a computer science place, but not only within computers, throughout all sorts of innovation, somebody in academia has thought about the idea being discussed, but it's like one or two people who were studying it as a potential thing. And then eventually that comes and they actually somebody creates a technology out of that. Has there been any technology that you've seen that was not predicted inside of a university beforehand?
Not sure exactly what your question is. Um, Stanford, the Stanford University Network, was unique for a lot of reasons. One is that it was a high-speed network on campus. It's a big campus, a lot of buildings, so they tied it all together.
Mm.
Um, but it was also uh, the institution itself felt a strong connection to the companies that were started, and they allowed professors to take stock in companies that they helped start. And there was a mostly unspoken expectation that if they did that and made a lot of money, that they would give some of that stock to the university. So Stanford's endowment is rich, and it's different than Yale or Harvard because Yale and Harvard didn't have that expectation. So it was like this really close connection between Stanford and the companies that started in Silicon Valley. Um, and other universities didn't really understand this. They didn't get it. So they really put blocks up to use intellectual property that had been developed in the university just because didn't understand. Um, that's begun to change, but still, it's still a struggle to get most universities to grant licenses to startups for technologies. Um, and of course, the government's had its own research, originally known as ARPA, Advanced Research Projects Agency, then DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and now there's one called EARPA, which is for energy.
Hmm.
So the government has played a role because they've had research operations funded, you know, by the government. So, and there's been movement back and forth between the universities and the government now, largely because of Stanford, between universities and companies. So there are some very wealthy professors at Stanford,
Hmm.
including the guy who was advising Larry and Sergey.
Hmm. Yeah, because they've seen it enough times because the period from well, so going back into history for the last 10 minutes or so, the semiconductor was invented by Shockley, and he didn't do it down in Pasadena at Caltech or any of the aerospace companies. So he came to Stanford, or not to Stanford, but he came to Silicon Valley because his mother lived in Palo Alto and she wanted to be
Yeah.
closer to that. And then Shockley then, but he didn't seem like he had much connection with Stanford. But then after that, Stanford started to become connected with,
Shockley worked at AT&T as a
yeah,
research.
yeah,
So he invented the internet at AT&T.
yeah.
You
Um,
can't really sort it out that well, but he invented a core part of it.
but then he didn't have much to do with Stanford. But then when did Stanford come into the picture?
So Stanford was founded in 1880, something like
Hmm.
that. So it was there all along. So
But in
the
terms of
uh,
technology, in terms of
when
technology
when
support, yeah.
Shockley didn't, but Fairchild Semiconductor was the
Mm,
first. Uh, was formed by the people that all got pissed off at Shockley because he was a terrible manager. Um, and then people at Fairchild, some of them left and started Intel. So there's a thread there, and most of them went to Stanford.
okay. Yeah.
Stanford had the research and academics who understood semiconductors
So
and
that's
all
where
of
that's probably it's probably Intel. So, and I'm actually checking this now on Perplexity. Intel is probably the connection between Stanford. Um, uh, I should ask for historical
it.
record because it didn't give me
Have
the
to
history.
have to throw Hewlett Packard in there because Hewlett and
Okay.
Packard to Stanford.
Oh, got it. That's probably it. Yeah, Hewlett Packard was probably because those
It's
they had.
very hard to sort this out and say it's one thing, right?
Yeah,
Hewlett Packard was originally an instruments company,
yeah.
and they saw the opportunity to have a company doing instruments while they were at Stanford when it was really hard to get instruments.
Okay. I guess
But
history.
it's, I mean,
Yeah,
it's a very blended
yeah.
thing where you can identify change points, but there were many change points. I mean, the whole industry that produces semiconductors was in Silicon Valley originally. And, TSMC is known as the one
New.
that
Yeah. Took it away.
understands 3 nanometer technologies.
Wait, actually, sorry. Wait, I've got a question. So, did you see the recent news about TSMC in Arizona that they did manage to get a breakthrough in terms of chip manufacturing in the United States? Did you see that?
Yeah, I don't think that they invented a breakthrough, but I think they are exporting from Taiwan. TSMC sees the same thing everybody else sees happening, which is that, the People's Republic of China is
Yeah.
whatever it is, 60 miles away. Um, so they're trying to move their core technologies out to other places so that they can handle if Taiwan gets taken over by
So,
China.
okay, this is the actual news. They achieved remarkable early production yields, surpassing similar facilities in Taiwan by approximately 4% percentage points. So
And
essentially, yeah.
did it refer to a particular
I,
nanometer?
uh, what nanometer? It did not, but I will find that. Oh no, it did. So first fab beginning production with 4 nanometer technology in first half of 2025. Second fab will produce 2 nanometer and 3 nanometer technology starting in 2028. Third fab will manufacture 2 nanometer or more advanced processes by the end of the decade.
So, um, 2 and 3 nanometers is really critical because nanometers, you can't really see it. But um, the iPhone 16 has 2 nanometer chips designed by
Okay.
Apple and produced by TSMC.
Okay.
So the microprocessors in there and the related chips are all in 2 nanometer technology, which means they can pack a lot more chips in. There's also a view that we've kind of met the match. The,
Mm,
Going from 2 to 1 is
not
not
possible.
possible.
Yeah.
So one of the things they're doing now is to stack the chips. So they have 2 nanometer chips and they're stacking them one on top of the other because they can use the connections between the layers in the stack to send data really fast rather than having to make them bigger and more spread out.
So it's so I was actually just talking about it with my sister, your daughter, that it's just so psychedelic. And this is why I'm so interested in the 1960s, is because what you just talked about, it's just like it's crazy. It's totally crazy that we're humans are able to do this. And the driverless cars that I saw everywhere in San Francisco, that's totally crazy. It's like, and it's
Did
gonna
you
have.
try one, by the way?
I did not drive one because they're more expensive. I like to be
They are more
economical.
expensive.
Yeah,
Ironically,
yeah,
they have 300 cars in San Francisco, and sometimes they would come in a couple of minutes, but often it would say your car can come in 14 minutes.
yeah,
You're
yeah.
like, well, screw that. I'll just take Uber because Uber
Well,
shows the way.
no, and I said screw that, and I'll take the e-bikes because
Yeah.
the e-bikes that Lyft has are now, if you get a membership, are actually very cheap, and they're right there as well. Oftentimes, it's a couple minute walk. So, like, I don't like to wait for anything, including the Uber at 6 minutes. Like, so, I actually spent very little money while I was in San Francisco, expecting that I would have to Uber everywhere, but I did not. Yeah.
E-bikes aren't necessarily for older people.
Yeah, that's true. Well, and the last thing as well, I interviewed a very interesting founder on my Crazy Wisdom podcast that I did it at your office, who is doing electric vehicle propulsion, and he's figured out a way to get electric motors in the shape of a UFO with 12 propulsion devices all around the central seating area inside of the person, and they're actually demoing at TechCrunch on Monday. So they got electric propulsion vehicle, which will be autonomous. And you know that I've been going into space recently, and then I was I was watching the autonomous vehicles, which I actually feel safer around on the bicycle than your normal San Francisco driver. Um, and uh, so now we got to map out what autonomous vehicles will be looking like in the air. And I find that to be fascinating. You may not even know this. The FAA actually created a
Just
category for electric
VTOL,
vehicles. Yeah.
vertical takeoff and lift.
Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Yep.
Um,
Okay.
yeah,
Well, yeah, that was a fun episode and see you guys next week.
yeah.